billed as a debate, but those of you who are expecting political style pugilism hopefully won't find it here. We're going to have a very, very lively discussion by some opinion leaders, important opinion leaders, thought leaders in the area of executive compensation, corporate governance, and CEO pay. They have squared off in the past the subject of CEO pay, and is it too high, and why is it too high is not a new one. It goes back probably to the Roman Empire. They have not been debating it that long, but they have appeared at other forums and discussed it. The catalyst for today's discussion, though, is focused on a paper that Charles and Craig have written in draft form. I believe it was available for you to download, and if you don't have it now, you can read it later. It's very good. It's I think the draft of October of 2012. I read the prior incarnation. It gets better every time, Charles and Craig. I can hardly wait to see the final in the spring edition of the Corporation Journal. It's like the Lance and Oprah tease. It just goes on and on. Charles wanted to break this panel into 2 days, so he could, maybe on Monday or Tuesday come back and do the second half. I said, no, that would be too much. I heard this presentation, as I said, at UCLA last September. We did not have an Ira Kay to ask the provocative questions. Maybe next time. But today we intend to make full use of their views and their positions and their knowledge. We have no antagonists, only protagonists that will go back and forth to talk about the question: is CEO pay like New York rents? Is it too damned high? If it is, or if it is not, how did it get here? What makes it what it is? What is the role of benchmarking in affecting the levels of CEO pay? Is benchmarking against peer group pay a good idea, bad idea? Why or why not? On what basis does it all rest, and is it sound? As Donna said today, the format for our discussion here, we'll call it a discussion, will be 15 minutes for Craig and Charles to present their views, then Ira another 15 minutes to present his views, then we'll go back in a lively interchange for half an hour on selected issues that we want to talk about. And then we do intend to have ample time for questions, as much as 30 minutes. Like to hold the questions till the end, and then we'll have a discussion. I know I met with some of you last night at another event from the Society of Corporate Secretaries, and there are strong views about this subject on all sides, from the investor community, from the company community. So this should be a great discussion, and it will be taped and available for others to look at later. So why don't we get started? Charles and Craig, will you tell us about your paper? It's called Executive Superstars, Peer Groups, and Overcompensation, Cause, Effect, and Solution. So the title does capture a point of view.
Topic is a little, how do we turn this guy on here? Whoops.
Down at the bottom.
Down bottom? Okay, got it. Oh.
I think that's on. Here, Charles, let me. I think it is on.
There, I got it. It's on. Perfect. Okay. First of all, I want to thank, obviously, the IRC Foundation for sponsoring this research, the conference board, and Latham for putting this on. And certainly it's good to see a lot of old friends. And appreciate y'all coming out at 8:30 in the morning in New York, a cold morning, to talk about compensation. That's pretty good. So thank you. The paper itself is sort of an interesting little adventure. It started, oddly enough, as an undergraduate research paper in a seminar I taught, Finance 418, at the university that was Craig's idea originally, and it sort of has morphed into a concept that I didn't expect when we started. It was actually initially going in a very different direction, and sometimes the data is more important than the direction you wish to take. And that's effectively what came out of it. But the story is basically pretty simple. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes and then turn over to Craig for the empirical part, and then sort of come back and try to sort of take lessons that we've gotten from the paper. But comp has gone up significantly in the last many years, and it obviously has been a source of great controversy. You've had two typical explanations for the increase in pay. The first was management capture theory, that management captures boards, boards pay salaries on demand, and that's why it keeps going up. The other theory, the market theory, says, well, so what? This is just great talent. You've got great superstars out there, terrific talent, and it's just a normal result of a serious market for a competitive market for talent. And this paper sort of steers between the two and suggests that both explanations are partially right, both explanations are wrong, one of which is, we feel, based on a false assumption, and try to come up with a third and we think ultimately much more effective explanation for the rise in pay and what we think is a better solution. To understand what we've done, you've got to look first at how pay is set. At most public companies today, pay is generally set, or total pay, or total target pay, is set by a process known as peer grouping or benchmarking, where the pay is created not on the basis necessarily of what internal pay structures are, what is done internally, but by comparing the pay to pay in similar, quote, peer companies. In other words, companies that are similar size, similar industry, companies that theoretically would attract the same talent. And the idea is to create this sort of rather than having an auction for executive talent, which you can't do when someone's there, creating a substitute auction, if you will, through the use of the process and attempting to determine the pay through an analysis of comparative and competitive companies. And the process itself has been controversial. For a long time, the view was that the process itself was gamed, that, and a lot of academic papers on this, that instead of picking, well, the goal was to pick better peers. The bigger the peers, the higher paying the peers, the more your own pay would go up. Because the way peers are done, once you create a peer group, the deal is to try to figure out where within the group should your executive fit. And typically, most companies tend to benchmark, if you will, or target either the 50th, 75th, or 90th percentile of their peers. And the idea would be, if you want to be in the median, you want the, obviously, or 75th or 90th, you want much bigger competitors that pay more, theoretically, to juice up the numbers. That's the sort of, if you will, the game playing in peer groups that people have talked about. And there have been a lot of academic papers out there on it. Are peer groups gamed? That's sort of problem number one. And if you are subscribed to the captured board theory of compensation increases, the idea would be the boards are dominated by the managers, the boards themselves pick peer groups in cahoots with managers, and pay goes up. That's sort of one explanation. And a lot of the reforms that you've seen out there, vis-a-vis Dodd-Frank and coming from institutional investors, have focused on that. Independent compensation committees, lots of stock ownership for the compensation committees, independent compensation consultants advising the committees. And the idea, frankly, was to, in fact, reduce the pernicious influence, if you will, of managers on peer group selection. You know, that you can game the selection. Now, additionally, one of the critiques of the peer group has been, in addition to the gaming, number two, is that peer groups by the nature of the application of the group, a la 50th, 75th, 90th percentiles, you're all going to see a ratchet effect. It's also known as the Lake Wobegon effect that came from a fellow named Ken West, who's sort of an early comp critic, that if everyone targets the median or above, that each year through a leapfrogging impact, pay will go up. Either it's going up dramatically because peer groups are gamed, or it's going up dramatically, even if they weren't gamed, by this process by which boards select 50th, 75th, 90th percentile. Boards, it's argued, rarely go below the 50th percentile because to do so, to say, oh, our executives pay below average, would suggest that you think they are below average, and then the issue isn't pay. The issue should be, do you keep a CEO who you don't think is performing effectively? And the argument goes that pay goes up through this process. Now, what's interesting about it is, what was the history of this thing? Where did this peer group process come from that dominates compensation, dominates the discussion? Was it the result of some great academic theory of years ago that somehow it appeared in the setting process? And the answer is no. Where it came from, oddly enough, we discovered through this paper, was kind of amusing. First of all, we discovered no one knew where it came from. We went to a number of different people. We've got all kinds of great stories. The best of which was that it started in a motel room in Indianapolis in 1967. It wasn't true. There was a meeting in a motel room, but it wasn't where this thing came from, apparently. But apparently it was developed as all roads eventually led to a fellow named Milton Rock, who founded the Hay Group, and was one of the founders, I should say, of the Hay Group. And he was apparently developed the notion of exchanging pay amongst CEOs as effectively a way to market something called Hay Points. It was sort of a tease, if you will, to get people into a room to talk about the use of a system called Hay Points, which at one point in time dominated compensation for middle and upper middle level management at most U.S. public companies. And it was sort of a fun way to get some people in a room to talk about pay. And what Kay did, what Milton Rock did was he agreed to get some of his clients into a room, and they gave him their compensation, these CEOs, as long before it was disclosed, and he then in the room sort of passed out the information, and everyone basically knew how everyone else was being paid, and it became sort of an annual thing, and basically it evolved into the process we know today. So the peer group process did not come about because of some great theoretical concept. It came about as basically a way to sell another particular product. But the theoretical underpinning of the process, nonetheless, has been quite important going forward. And it has to do with the nature of what an executive can do or can't do. The theory was that executive talent was transferable, that this was the superstar theory, that a great manager can run any company. And the theory would be, if that manager can run any company, then you pick a number of companies that the executive could theoretically move to, and that created the competitive scheme, sphere, if you will, for attempting to set the pay. The pay was the result of a, quote, competitive process. But because you didn't have an auction, you created an auction through the use of this, quote, peer group. And the goal was obviously creating a peer group of relevant companies to which the executive could move. And at that point, you could come up with some sort of a relative scheme for pay, and hence the median, above median, and way above median scale of pay. And what we discovered through our research was, A, the history of the process, which we thought was sort of interesting, but more importantly, the theoretical underpinning of the process was the notion that talent was transferable between companies. Peers are relevant, not only relevant, but critical to the process, because a peer could recruit you. You could go to a peer. And what we discovered, and as I'm going to turn this over to Craig Ferrere, was effectively that the underpinning of the process is easy transferability talent, which everyone believed for a long time. I've certainly, as a director, believed it and believed in the superstar theory, and you wanted to attract the best possible talent. And it turns out I was wrong. But what's interesting is this notion of transferability fits very neatly into the market theory for compensation. The captured board theory said the boards were dominated by managers, and pay went up because managers took advantage of the situation, manipulating peer groups, picking friendly directors. The market theory said, no, this is a result, the increase in pay is the result of competition, if you will, amongst talented people. And what we discovered in our work was that, number one, the whole thing was based around the peer. And the explanation for the increase in pay wasn't necessarily the captured board anymore, because boards have gotten a lot better. It was based on a market, but the market itself was based on this notion of competition for talent, talent that could move easily between organizations. And we attempted to recreate this through the peer process itself, through the use of peers. But what we discovered is, A, peers can be gamed, hence sort of the reforms to reduce the ability of managers to game the peer group. But more importantly, the peer group, through seeking the median, above median, or way of median level, itself mathematically, the process itself led to an increase in pay. But the process itself was entirely dependent on this notion of transferability of talent. And what we discovered that wasn't necessarily true. And for that, I'll turn it over to Craig.
I first want to attempt to frame this discussion by laying out very briefly where I think our disagreement lies, or at least where I think the core of our disagreement lies. We will argue, and it's implicit in our thesis, that there's a wedge between what a CEO could make in alternative opportunities or as outside opportunities and what they're paid. And Ira, I think, would argue that that's less significant, that they're paid closer to the outside opportunities. And of course, he would argue that pay has gone up because those outside opportunities have increased. That's the market explanation. The outside opportunities are the market. Now, if we're correct, then peer groups are not used by necessity to retain executives. They're used either from a false belief in transferability or some vague sense of CEO equity between CEOs. And of course, the next conclusion that we draw is that peer groups are somehow undesirable and lead to the wrong results with pay. I'll describe the data we have and what the empirical research has found very quickly. There's a good data set that all researchers use, or most, that tracks the pay of the top 1,500 companies, the largest 1,500 companies, the pay of the CEO, and the next 5 highest paid or so for about 2 decades, from 1992 until now. So it's quite easy to see whether CEOs really are transferring between companies as we would expect, and also people can look at performance of CEOs in different situations. And what they found is there's one study that looked at the S&P 500 during a 5-year period, and rather than CEOs jumping company to company as you would expect with the market, they found 6 instances in 5 years for 500 companies. The next expanded it a little broader, 10 years, and found 12, 15 or so instances of a jump between companies. So but also companies, though, as you know, hire a lot of outsiders, and we kind of looked at that as whether maybe the outside hiring can be a cause, and where is it coming from if they're not jumping company to company. It turns out when you distinguish between maybe turnaround companies and your more healthier, normal company, there's a very clear distinction between how each of them hire CEOs and where the CEOs come from. The healthy companies hire internal CEOs, and if they hire an external, they do much worse doing so. And the turnarounds hire external people, outsiders, and they do better with the outsiders. So it's a very clear distinction. And although maybe 10 years ago outside hiring peaked at 40%, maybe companies have stabilized and it's down to 20 these days. And now whether these outside hirings drive CEO pay and whether they cause an increase, this outside hiring, it turns out that 80% or so or more are actually not CEOs but more junior executives. And that when they do jump from company to company, they go from a larger company to a much smaller one, meaning that it's not possible to run, or not that they don't do as well at different companies as the one that they were at previously, meaning that internal experience is very important to operating a company. So what the data means, if we can try to interpret it, is that as we stated before, I think we must view pay as somewhat subjective, as there being a difference between how the market would value the CEO and maybe what their value is to the company they're at after the experience. And internal CEOs have 20 years experience usually or more. And if we view it that way, then you could pay less, you could pay significantly less, and the CEO is not necessarily going to leave, as the market theory would suggest. So what as a corollary, though, are they not perfectly reasonable to use a peer group to kind of resolve this uncertainty? Whether if you just target the median or target what other companies are paying, is that just a reasonable second best solution to this problem? That's where I think we see the issue. There's, of course, the ratcheting effect, and there's the leapfrogging effect, which is, there's the authors here, I believe, of a paper who came up with the term from Columbia of lower paying people jumping above the median, or below median paid executives jumping above. And there's, in fact, a significant effect of being below the median results in what one study says an average of $1.2 million more than being above the median in a pay raise. And why this is a problem, though, is that I think before Hay and before the peer groups were invented, executive pay was based on a more localized context. It was based on what maybe the executive made before the promotion and what they made last year. It was based maybe on what other executives in the area made, maybe the bank president, the lawyers in town. And this kept it in check. This I think, kept it reasonable. There's a downward pressure to it. But when we ignored these internal factors and started looking exclusively externally and targeting to the median, I think it became disconnected from what was appropriate to the organizations. It became an independent system in itself, and two independent systems are bound to diverge. And that's where I think it's bad for morale. I think high pay affects how other employees view the company, how stakeholders view it, and ultimately the performance of the company is affected by pay that is not consistent with what's appropriate to the organization.
So the takeaway is, what does all this mean? And if you get down to it, what happened was we evolved from a system of internal pay to a system of external based pay on the notion of the transferability of talent, a market for executive talent. And what the empirical work shows is that transferability just wasn't there, that it wasn't as easy as you think to take talent and move from company to company. And if that's true then an external-based formula for pay doesn't make sense. And because of the problem of leapfrogging and the problem, obviously, of the Lake Wobegon effect, you've sort of locked yourself into an ever-increasing pay scale. So what's the solution? If it's based on transferability that doesn't really exist, what do you replace it with? And our proposal is really to go back to an internal-based model, if you will. In other words, DuPont, for example, for many years has taken the CEO's pay is a fixed multiple of the direct reporting officers of the CEO. There's some multiple thereof, which is interesting. DuPont hasn't lost a lot of talent and hasn't done too terribly badly with that particular model. That's one approach, but I think the overarching emphasis is that pay needs to be done within the context of the organization itself. That if the talent, once you become a CEO, isn't readily transferable. We argue in the paper, by the way, that lower-level talent is transferable. General counsel, CFOs do move, and they should be based on peers. On the other hand, the CEO is in a unique position, and the talent that they exercise in that position is probably unique to that company. And for that reason, the ability to move is not altogether that great. And when comp committees review this, instead of focusing on external factors, we believe they should focus on the internal pay structure, internal performance data to develop a rational scheme for the compensation of the CEO. And we believe that begins to bring, if not bring levels down, certainly stabilize levels where they are and to get us out of the dramatic increases in this disconnect that you see between pay, CEO pay increases, and A, the performance of the company, and B, the pay of the rest of the employees of the company.
So Charles and Craig have laid out the problem as they see it with peer groups and the underlying theory of it. I think the second part of our dialogue ought to be on how we fix the problem, if we think it's a problem, and talk about some of the things you touched on at the end. Ira, how do you see the problem? Do you think it's a problem? Do you view it in the same way that Charles and Craig do?
So yes, I agree that quits are low and the rest is commentary, I guess. So, well, first of all, let me thank you, Jim, for hosting, and thanks, Donna and the Conference Board Corporate Governance Center for having me here, and thanks to Charles and Craig for writing a very provocative and important topic, paper, because this topic, it's hard to believe that 80 New Yorkers got up early to come and talk about peer groups. And that's actually one of my points that I want to make. So here, I wanted to make 5 or 6 sort of rebuttal, I guess, points. I guess I disagree with the proposition, to be formal here. But it is true that CEOs rarely quit, but that's a strategy outcome to a large extent, and I'll come back to that, that they are in fact locked in. Now you could argue, well, that's a mistake, they shouldn't do that, but they are clearly locked in, and I'll come back to that. Number 2, Charles and Craig have basically lost this argument dramatically and I think nearly definitively in the court of public opinion for corporate governance, and that is that ISS and the SEC basically, I'm not a lawyer and I don't even play one on TV, but it is something where it's been practically mandated that in fact you must have a peer group. ISS has completely changed the game on this, and I'll come back to that also. The number 3, peer data clearly moves up and down. Actually, I wanted to say, so you have a couple of chapters that I highlighted in the printout, and then you have the full book. The book was intended to be a full, complete, and robust answer to a lot of these things, some of which are correct, like the quits being low. And it does contain everything we know, and that's, of course, why it's so thin. But we did try to say everything. And we'd show in there, the third point, that peer data clearly moves up and down. I have been told many times I should try to be less black and white and more subtle and less, I guess, Manichean. And Charles and Craig could probably do that also. To say it, and I have a quote in the book that says, it's dramatically, CEO pay has increased dramatically more than the stock market. That is patently false. And that it only goes up is patently false. I looked at 3, well, I'll come back to that. Number 4, peer data is in fact only one factor. It is not dispositive, if I'm allowed to use that term with lawyers, in terms of influencing peer group, and I'll come back to that also. Another court of public opinion, the say-on-pay votes have dramatically embraced the executive pay model. Now maybe the shareholders don't know, and I've heard this said by critics, they don't know exactly what they're voting on, which is confusing to me because it's only a yes or a no. But you know, they have dramatically endorsed. There have been 5,000 votes thus far, another 2,500 coming up in the next few months. And nearly 98% of the companies have had an endorsement of their executive pay model. Of the 5,000, approximately 100 have failed. And then 6 is, and the reason for that is that the pay model works. It clearly works. It definitely needs improving. That's why we did sort of the turning point, and the dichotomy that we present is that you know, sustain it more or less at this current successful level, or you know, dramatically over-regulate it and change a model that has in fact created trillions of dollars of value. And we think we do the dominant research in this area on what we call realizable pay. And that has demonstrated, using thousands of companies over 10 years, that in fact the companies with high-paid CEOs who have this concept of realizable, which needs definition, but in any event, a very valid concept that ISS has adopted from us, that it's much better than the summary compensation table number. And it is, so the high realizable pay CEOs work for high-performing companies, and the ones with low realizable pay work at low-performing companies. I don't know what else one might want in this. So let me give a little more details on this. So I've read the academic literature on quitting also, and I've referenced a few of the articles in the book. And it is true that about 1% of CEOs voluntarily quit per year. My number's a little, it's not my number. I think the Conference Board does a study on this, and Spencer Stewart does a study on this, and it's pretty clear that about 1%. Another 9% get changed every year, and they retire, which is a form of quitting, by the way. They get fired, and you know, mostly not, occasionally for cause for drunk driving or something, but mostly for performance. And so there's a lot of turnover, a fair amount of turnover, but the voluntary part is correct, that it's only about 1%. But they are completely locked in, and this has transformed, by the way, the recruiting industry. The recruiting strategy of companies. So I've been involved with 3 major CEO searches over the last 2 years, and recruiting another CEO was absolutely out of the question. And the reason it was out of the question, and we did the work on this, is that they had about $25 million each, depending, of unvested stock and pension, without even including enhanced pension values. And no one, since basically, unfortunately, Mr. Nardelli, Bob Nardelli, went to Home Depot, no one, and that was much larger than that, but just people won't take the risk, and it is risky, promoting a CEO and hiring a CEO, so no one will take that risk for $25 million and be excoriated in the press for having made such a colossal waste of shareholder value. And so they are completely locked in. So what the 3 companies, they did in fact do what Charles and Craig said. They recruited a division head who had about $8 million worth of stock, and they bought them out of that. Still risky from a human capital succession process, but nevertheless much lower visibility and risk and cost. And each of those companies dismissed recruiting a CEO, which they probably needed. It was dismissed out of hand from the beginning by the search committee. And and there's, I guess in some of the research, maybe even the Conference Board, they find that when you hire from the outside, they don't perform as well. I talk about this in one of my chapters, and that is, you really need to factor in that when you go outside, as Charles said, it really is a much harder thing. And they do get, interestingly, they get much more money than they made before. But now, and there's a number of game-changing things in here, they typically, in all 3 instances, they make less money than the prior CEO. And that's sort of my third point about moving up and down. So ISS, second point. ISS and the SEC clearly use peer groups. It's a little like if you're reading Lynn Stout or Roger Martin on the criticism of shareholder value, is the god of shareholder value is a colossal error, they say, and it's destroying. I don't know what it's destroying, but it's doing bad and evil things. And whether that's right or wrong, that game is over. That it is going to be a total shareholder return, and it is going to be the use of peer groups, because the SEC is clearly a regulatory agency, and the ISS is their extension, a quasi-regulatory body, unregulated regulatory body. But nevertheless, they are very influential, and they have basically demanded peer groups, and everyone is scrambling around. The last 2 months, ISS opened the window a little bit on modifying your peer group, and hundreds of companies sort of submitted new peer groups, and to get over the terrible peer groups that ISS picked last year, and ISS has in fact improved this process dramatically, and the companies are applauding that. So there's more emphasis on peer groups, not less. And to answer one of Charles's specific criticisms, the gaming, I've read the literature on the gaming literature also on peer group. Companies have, over the years, picked companies that are larger than they are. We fought them on that. I certainly tried to fight them on that to no avail. And it basically took Say on Pay and ISS to end that. But that is over. You cannot pick a peer group where you're at the 25th percentile of size. You will just, it will be problematic for you. You will, if you set your pay on that, you will fail. You'll get an against from ISS, highly likely, and you will fail your Say on Pay vote. And you know, but basically, the way I look at this is like the peer group process is the quote that I like to use from Voltaire, and he's the only dead person that I actually quote, and that is, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is, you know, the peer groups are flawed, but they are in fact, you know, that's the, you know, the only game in town. And companies no longer, I think if there was academic research now covered the last 2 or 3 years, they would find that the peer group sizes are much more appropriate. Let's see. It does move up and down. We use 3 different sources of pay: realizable pay, realized pay, and what we call pay opportunity. Those terms need to be, they are very powerful terms. And ISS is moving away from strictly using pay opportunity. Because Charles is, another thing he's correct on that's very difficult for me to say, is that in fact, ISS does use the pay opportunity, the numbers in the chart, in the summary compensation table, and then they do their performance. And companies do not set their pay opportunity based upon recent financial performance. Our research on this, economic research, confirms that. They use it to set opportunity, and they do use the peer data for that. But they do not, for 2 things. It moves dramatically up and down using the 3 different sources we found. And if, you know, you can turn to page 91 of my little booklet. It's not, there aren't 91 pages in there, it's just selected pages from the book. And you can see that about 30% of the time it went down, and it peaked in 2007, as did that CEO pay ratio, from 400 to 1 to about 200 to 1. And therefore, you can't say that it only goes up. And on the next page, we show a chart that clearly shows that, like Gabay, a very famous article out of an NYU professor who demonstrates that the reason CEO pay has gone up is because of scale, because of globalization, and the companies are that much larger, and that is in fact, contrary to what my opponents say here, it has become, the labor market has become global for some jobs and not just local, and not the other way. So it does move up and down. It clearly has come down. And by the way, my opinion is we're in a bear market for the labor market for CEOs is in a bear market, which probably will be bad for stock market and probably bad for economic performance. Because of the ISS as a regulatory body is homogenizing CEO pay practice, which is terrible. Capitalism requires a broad array of ideas and innovation, and ISS is clipping the wings of all of the outliers, and everybody's going to have a performance share plan based upon relative TSR, like the UK does, and the executives there hate it. And I don't think the shareholders are happy with it either. So there's a risk on that, and stock options are being, ISS is opposed to stock options. They think they're not performance-based. They are categorically wrong about that. But nevertheless, stock options are declining, and so therefore CEO realizable pay is also going to come down, maybe for the better or worse, but it is going to come down, and probably for the worse. Not that they should be highly paid, but because they will be only highly paid if the stock price goes up. Number 4, peer data is only one factor. Charles and Craig have a beautiful analogy in their book on the suspension bridge built by engineers. I love that. And they basically say, you know, you need to know more than, you know, about, I don't know what, physics and geology to build a bridge. You have to know everything about the bridge and the area and the surface and the square root of pi and all sorts of things. And that is exactly how peer data is used. It is one of many factors. I would say fewer than 10% of my clients are actually slaves to the market data, where they say, the market data, market median moved this much, and it didn't, and we have to raise ours 3%. If it didn't move, we don't have to raise it. That is, I advise companies not to do that. I think fewer and fewer companies that do that. It's just one of the many things. And I also think, in that vein, that I know you found one example of a 90th percentile, a company that targets 90th percentile. Just think about that. What that means is that of 1,000 companies, you want to set your pay opportunity higher than 900 of them. And there have been over the years a few have done that. No one, or to my knowledge, literally to my knowledge, no one does it. There may be a few. And people can't even target the 75th percentile. If you target the 75th percentile in the ISS peer group and you don't perform, you're going to have a problem. So it's practically 50-50. And by perform, I mean stock price go up higher than your peers. It's a very precise and dangerous, razor's edge of a test, because if you've had 3 years of good stock price, what's the probability that the next 3 years are going to be good stock price movement relative to peers? It's extremely low, and eventually you will underperform, and therefore you will fail this ISS test. So you can't use the 75th percentile. You have to set it at the median, which we agree with, and then let performance convert your realizable pay into the 75th percentile or the 25th percentile, hopefully aligned with your performance. As I said, 2 years of say on pay votes. The shareholders, and I think the critics, some of whom are in the room, who pushed, I guess the state of Connecticut played a big role in this, pushing the SEC, well, I guess pushing the legislation in Dodd-Frank to create the say on pay votes mandatory, that this was going to be the panacea that was going to end rising executive pay, that was going to create aligned performance, that was going to fix income inequality and cure the common cold, and it basically did none of those things, especially the common cold part. So the, that they thought there were going to be a lot of failures. I was fairly confident, and I think I had a quote somewhere that said, that most companies are going to pass. I thought it was going to be 95% plus. Turned out to be 98% passed swimmingly, and that's because, my view on that is that the shareholders are endorsing the model. At a minimum, they're not rejecting it. They're not rejecting the null hypothesis in that sense, and they are, in fact, they're not dissatisfied. Now, maybe if they're a little dissatisfied, they still wouldn't vote against it. They could sell the stock. There's other alternatives. But nevertheless, the say on pay votes is a huge endorsement. And the peers, because of the SEC and ISS, virtually every large cap company has a peer group listed in their proxy. So therefore, it's not like this is a trick. There's no leisure domain here where it's being hidden. So this is a very powerful process. And then I guess I really covered on the 6-point on realizable pay. The outcomes of this are that it is a highly aligned program. High-performing CEOs, and based on stock price, relative stock price, are at high-paid company. They get high pay, low and low. There are a few that are high pay, low performance, and they stick out. And then there are a few more, actually, that are low pay for high performance, and those are always the ones that are extolled by GMI and some of the other proxy groups. And they're always a unique set of circumstances, and if their CEO wants to work in that environment, so be it. So the most important, I think, direct response is about the quitting. And just to come back to that they are locked in. They have $25 million worth of unvested stock. They have pensions that are extremely valuable. A pension, a defined benefit pension plan, even if non-qualified, is extremely lucrative. There are CEOs, right or wrong, who have $20, $30, $40 million of pension value. That does enhance, that does go up an escalator when they hit 55, 60, 62, 65, and it locks them in. And it was explicitly designed to have a human capital strategy of long-term retention. And I think that it has worked in those industries. It has, in fact, retained, and there's been tremendous returns on that human capital. So they don't quit because they're locked in. Now, in my opinion, if we granted everything vested, can you imagine if I made that recommendation that you should grant all the stock vested? They would have a new advisor in a minute. And basically, if you granted it all vested, I think quitting would be between 5 and 10%. They would take the gains and then move on. Now, the reason a CEO wouldn't quit, they have, I don't know if this is going to be shocking to you, they have a lot of hubris. CEOs, I don't know if you were aware of that. And they think that they're going to do a better job of driving the stock price than other people will do. And they really do stay. They'll have $100 million worth of stock and $12 million unvested. Those CEOs don't stay for the $12 million. They stay to drive the $100 million. And I think on the average, they're right. Not that they do a better job, but they will have the most influence over that, and therefore they stay to drive their stock price. I think The quitting would be, the voluntary quits would be somewhere between 5 and 10%. I've asked a couple of experts about that. I got a couple of agreement on that. Some people said it wouldn't matter. But you know, my own opinion is that they would quit substantially more. I guess I'll rest for the moment.
Well, I think we've joined the issue, and I see Charles got 5 or 6 points there that he wants to specifically address. But clearly, you think there's a problem with the market, and the pay is too high. And we have Ira saying it's really actually a good thing. It's consistent with the market. In fact, is driving stock prices and capitalism and all the great things that we endorse. So.
Well, I think I was saying that pay is a wave. It goes up and down. It's not consistently up. And pay is, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Craig, you want to take that point? Because we kind of talked about this before, and we'll go through we'll go through each of these points because I want to respond.
We'll do about 15 minutes, then 15 minutes, and then we'll have audience participation.
Excellent.
First, thank you, Ira, too. I mean, your points are excellent. They've really, reading through your book in the last few days has helped me kind of work through our thesis and find weaknesses in it, maybe strengthen our thinking on the idea. You haven't changed my mind, but it's been fun reading.
You have to read it again then, I guess.
Yes, I'll repeat until it sticks. I want to first be clear about the realized pay versus expected pay. Realized pay is certainly a great metric, and it's very helpful to investors. But as far as our thesis goes, it's what we're concerned with is the expected pay at the grant date, what the CEO and what the comp committee expects to get. And as counterintuitive as it may be, the structure of pay actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with agency issues or with management capture or whatever you wish to call it. For whatever grant date expected value, you can construct pay in many different ways that would have the same value. All cash is equivalent to a certain amount of all stock. So it really comes down to risk preferences or other factors of the effort or disutility, things that are unrelated to the agency and the management capture theory. So what our theory talks about is this expected grant date pay. And realized pay, what the value is at the end of the year, depending on the stock price, you'd expect to go up and down with the market. It's almost a tautology. If it's 80% stock and equity and grants, of course when the market's up, the pay will be up, and when it's down, the pay will be down. We're concerned with the expected pay at the beginning of the year. And now the expected pay does move, and we don't want to be perceived as thinking a very complicated issue with many causes and many different drivers. Comes down to one factor alone. Its pay has risen for quite a while, and it has kind of halted its rise a bit during this decade. And we have to remember that this decade was punctuated by 2 major recessions, both of which dramatically changed the composition of the S&P 500. And in one instance resulted in a lot of pressure to drive down pay at financial companies. And it'd be crazy for us to say that ratcheting would persist straight through that. So I think if we want to analyze whether this up and down that we've particularly seen in the 2000s is a new regime maybe where the bubble has reached the top, or whether it's just a brief diversion from the trend, it's helpful to look back at the very long term, which is that following the Second World War, pay was flat at about $1.2 million in $2,000 for a 30-year period until the early 1970s. And then in the 1970s, it doubled during that decade. It doubled during the 80s. And during the 90s, it doubled twice. And then it reached a peak in the 2000s when we then had the technology bubble burst, and you lost a lot of high-paid founders, fell out of the S&P 500 index, and a lot of people probably took resulting pay cuts because of the collapse of a significant bubble and the change in the economy. And then, of course, it was down for a year or so, and it started to rise again until 2007, when we had the financial crisis. And of course, at that time, a lot of companies in the index were financial. And it, of course, fell again. This is the up and down, which would be crazy not to expect. And different companies fell out of the S&P 500 index as well. But although it was down for a couple of years, it started to rise again, and we're now near the peak in this year. We're approaching the last peak in pay, and who knows what it will do in the future. Our guess is that it will continue to rise again, as expected pay will continue. But who knows what will happen, who will prove right or wrong. But to sum up, I think that expected pay is what we have to focus on. At the end of the year, expected pay can take a lot of different forms. But it's the beginning, grant date pay is what we're concerned with. And the up and downs, I think we can explain through the two major recessions. And absent those recessions, it's continually risen since the 70s, a trend that's new and that didn't exist after the Second World War until that period. And I think that leads us to believe that there's a certain ratcheting. And I'll add also that our thesis, peer groups are built on a similar industry, and our thesis depends on a consistent group, a consistent sample. And the S&P 500 used as a group is not the best proxy for our thesis, because in even years like 2001, there was 30 companies dropped out of the index and 30 new ones added. And there's a paper that I think helps better with these long-term trends is Kevin Murphy, who's well known in this field, looks at just the S&P 500 companies that were in 93, just those companies, which of course you then get a different bias of surviving. But if you just look at those companies, pay rises, although more modestly than the other data would suggest, straight through 2000, 2001, and it reaches its peak in 2007 at the recession, and then it picks up slightly again, which is again 1970 to 2007, a sustained upward rise, which indicates to us a problem.
Let's take the next point, which was the ISS point, which I think is a good one. You're right. ISS does use it, and it is dispositive of ISS, as is Glass Lewis.
And we all know ISS is always right. So.
And ISS is always right. But I think ISS created their peer groups, and as did Glass Lewis, as a response to the use of peer groups by the companies. And that was the gaming theory. The companies were viewed as gaming them. ISS said, we'll create our neutral list so as to make you more honest in gaming. That doesn't indicate on the part of ISS a firm, solid support of the peer group. It was a reaction to pay practices, a reaction to disclosure. And ISS, and in fact I was at Glass Lewis yesterday talking with them about what they were doing with Equilar in creating peer groups. I think either of those voting services, frankly, are really much more responsive to their clients, the institutions themselves, who may begin to see a problem with the use of the peer group. Remember, the peer group is all founded on this very important concept of the easy transferability of talent. And if that falls, then the whole notion of using the peer group has to fall. And my suspicion is, despite the fact those institutions are quote-unquote wedded to the process as a way to check what was being done by the companies themselves, I don't think it's certainly written in either of their charters that peer groups are a fundamental part of the process. And I think if you take away the fundamental underpinning of the process and their clients demand a change, they will probably change too.
And Charles, let me add a point on that. ISS and Glass Lewis are businesses. And frankly, it's best for their business model if there's constant turmoil. So, you know, if they thought there was more money to be made over the next 15 years and moving off of peer groups and saying, let's have a brand new model, let's look at internal pay equity. Why not do that? If I were running that business, that's what I would do.
Right. So I'm not as concerned about the next point on pay is an interesting point too. You're right, Ira. They did pass. A lot of them passed. A lot of them because they're being negotiated between the companies and the rating agencies. But I think what's interesting too is that while the question is, what do you mean by passing? If you mean greater than 50%, yeah, a lot did. But there have been a significant no votes in a lot of companies. And in other words, to me, a passage of 80% may seem like a big number, but it indicates a negative vote of 20. And any time you have 20 or anything double-digit opposing you on any sort of resolution, I think that's problematic for the company itself. Companies have to move with near unanimity. And any time you see a dissatisfaction level over a double digit at a company, there's a problem. To me, at least as a director, there's a problem, because it means at some point that number could grow and it becomes a base, if you will, to put the company into play. And I've always been troubled, even though you win, you lost. If you win by 55%, that's not, in my view, at least in the corporate setting, not really winning. In the political setting, maybe. But in the corporate setting, if that many people are opposed to you, either they'll sell the stock and get out, which is a problem, or there'll be trouble for you down the road. So I'm not as comfortable with taking from the say and pay approval rates a general satisfaction feel with investors on the state of pay. Secondly, it's kind of like the emperor has no clothes. Everyone is sort of thinking on peer groups. And if you take away the underpinning of the peer group, then in fact maybe the emperor looks kind of silly, clothed in a peer group, if you will, which I think also will have a significant impact on the way investors move. In fact, since this paper has come out, there have been apparently a couple of shareholder resolutions floating around calling for the de-emphasis of the peer group. And I've heard from a lot of the large institutions that they are troubled by it and are beginning to think of alternatives, a la this internal model as opposed to an external model. The next point you make was a good one, so I'm going to turn to Craig for that. You said that peer groups are not dispositive. They're but one factor in the process. Want to take that?
I think that peer groups are, I think people who work in this area know the importance of peer groups. I think that you start the process with a target in mind and with a level that you want to achieve, and you build the architecture of the package around that level. And at the end of the day, that's what you check at the end. And I think in some of the materials, Ira's book, it's admitted as well that peer groups are more important than other factors at the end of the day, that getting the target correct is the end game. And I think as far as what the results are and what that would suggest for us, total shareholder return or measures of performance have very little to do with the expected pay. There's almost no correlation between performance, as you would expect, and pay. It's because it's driven by, we think, this peer group. And actually, most other measures that you think would be economically important really have little explanatory power except maybe the size of the firms, which again is implicit in the peer group process and how it's constructed. But we do find that there is a large effect, or a paper by some financial economists finds that of all these measures, being below the peer group actually has one of the biggest effect. That being below the peer group results in an average of $1.2 million more raised the next year. And it's that indicates how critical these peer groups are to the process. That of all things that could influence it, peer groups influence it the most, and performance not hardly at all.
And frankly, if you look, I think it's 48 and 49 of the book, there's a really good paragraph in there that says, what? Oh, no, a lot of it was good for this particular answer, that suggests that the market itself drives the pay as opposed to TSR, that the market is a critical element in driving pay, a la the peer group. But look, beyond that, I think you have to make an interesting point, too, about the CEOs are locked in. And I think that's, in other words, that they rarely move because they're locked in through contractual protections. What I've discovered as a director, and I'm sure a lot of folks here have realized in looking at the field, there's no such thing as an ironclad contract, number one. Contracts are made to be broken. The question is, who's going to pay for it? And typically, if a company decides to take away a CEO, recruit away a CEO, they will make up the difference in the contract. I mean, that's what the Eisner case was all about, if you think about it. It was, the fact that he left Ovitz, well, Eisner/Ovitz. If you look at any time, or most times, I mean, I was involved in a situation where a CEO was locked in, I thought, because of creative vesting and use of options. The person picked up and went to another enterprise, and they simply wrote a check and paid for the value it was missed. And we said, well, this will keep him there. And in fact, it didn't. And one thing I realized is that if someone's going to move, if someone's willing to pay more, they will move. The question is, why were they willing to pay more? It's because they believed they would add value to the other operation. And oddly enough, I think the data seems to suggest when people do move, unless it's for a turnaround, that typically the performance isn't as expected. And you have a mindset, I think, in place that we are going to hire away the best talent and they're going to do a terrific job with us. And oftentimes, the superstar doesn't end up being a superstar at the next company. That's why I say emperor without any clothes, that the mindset seems to be that we can hire someone away and they'll do great things for us. Yes, under certain circumstances. In the context of a company with a serious managerial stain, or let's say a company that is trying to sell itself, but in the normal standard situation, the superstar ultimately becomes a supernova. And I think or super black hole, I should say. And I think that's sort of a false assumption. And that's, I think, the point the paper is making, that the reason you don't have as many transfers, to explain it on the basis of they're locked in by the contract or locked in by creative vesting, doesn't ultimately turn out to win the day. If someone really wants you, they will make up the difference. If Finn Fogg is here, he and I had an episode like that many, many years ago. I don't know if he recalls it, where someone was said that they would move, and and the company to which they might have moved, it was clear had in the past been willing to make up, if you will, the difference in pay that the person would walk from, in fact, when they left. So that the threat to move was, in fact, to the board credible. Craig?
And the few CEOs who do jump from company to company, they move to much larger enterprise. It's not worth it for anybody, apparently, to make lateral moves. They jump, and when they move, they go to a very large company that is 2, 3, 4 times as big. And considering that, you have to kind of view the median targeting as ultimately arbitrary. If somebody's going to come and make another offer, the chances that it's at the median of your peer group are slim. It could be higher, it could be lower. The median is an arbitrary number until you have an actual outside offer and a negotiation, and then you can have a real, I guess, market price or auction price, so to speak. But until then, the median is just a number. It's arbitrary. It doesn't tell you anything about what the actual existing offers are for that executive, which we think are not much. And there's also, to go around this, there's a paper that has a sort of exogenous test of this lock-in. It's where a company's merger or for whatever reason the CEO is let go, and they separate out mergers, and when the CEO finds another job, if they do, it's at smaller companies for less pay. And when other executives do, it's at smaller companies and less pay.
So Ira, why don't you address some of those points, or any other points you want to address?
Did we get all your points? I think we got them all. But if we didn't,
I think so.
Okay.
So I'll try to use all of my willpower to mitigate my competitive instincts to say that they basically agreed with everything I said. Because that's basically, I have biased ears, but that's what I heard. So let me sort of go a slightly different direction and continue to try to let's have a dialogue or think about this. So, so public companies, diversified shareholders, fragmented shareholders, free rider problems, agency problems, they have all these problems. And there's no one really, even TIA Craft or Vanguard, they own like 1% of the equities. Each one owns about 1%. So there's a terrible free rider problem for them to really sort of go after this. And maybe the boards and management take advantage of it. But I think there's enough other pressures. And now this big dog, ISS, and say on pay votes has really become a major factor in sort of the corporate governance environment. But you look at, and I do a fair amount of work with private equity and private family-owned companies. They have the exact same methodology. They use peer groups. And I've been trying to think about how to get that in here, because that's a very important point, if not dispositive. I have a private equity client, and and the boards, they grind their teeth, just like they do in the public world, but the boards do look at the peer data because they don't know what else to do, if they're taking a public company private or whatever it is. And then family companies do the exact same thing. I have a family company, a $5 million family company, not an insignificant thing. They use the same peer data. Now they put a little discount on it and so on, but they do the exact same thing. And there are many examples of it. Bankruptcy courts allow the use of peer data. When the creditors take over, there's all kinds of examples where it's the exact same thing, where you have a concentrated shareholder, no free rider problem. Where if I worry about this, I'm putting out the money to fix this problem, but all these other shareholders will free ride on my nickel. Private companies, private equity, where it's concentrated ownership, they don't have it, and they use peer groups. I think that's another very powerful argument. Another is, that it is true, and I acknowledge this in the book, in my chapter, that the boards work 10 days a year on the company, and the CEOs work, you know, every day, obviously. The boards think about executive pay, you know, cumulative, you know, 30 days a year, 20 days a year. The CEOs think about it every hour of every day, of every month, of every week. You know, they think about it all the time. And they're coming up with some angle and so on and so on. So there is this, you know, is there an inclination to err on the side of a little more to avoid, you know, to pay them $1.2 million extra in a $3 billion company? It's a couple of basis points. Is that a tendency? There definitely is. And you know, now the question is, do the shareholders get a return on that human capital? And for Craig to say that realizable pay is tautologically, of course it goes up. If you know, if the realizable pay goes up and the stock price goes up, first of all, that's not true. It is clearly not a tautology. But on the average, it's true. And the question is, so what's the problem? Isn't that the whole point? I mean, there's a fundamental disagreement. That's what the boards want, and that's how they design it. And they do the pay opportunity or the target pay, which does go up and down. And I thought Craig's excuses were quite feeble for, you know, does it go up? Is it a ratchet? I looked up ratchet in the dictionary, and it says, you know, if you have, you know, it's like a boat thing where it's, I forget, with the Framus, with the skyhook, you know, where it goes like that, and it can't go backwards. And, you know, it's not a ratchet. It moves up and down with the stock market, and I think the shareholders are satisfied with that. Another very important aspect of this is, and Roger Martin, who's at the business school at the University of Toronto, he is opposed to total shareholder return, like Lynn Stout at Cornell. And he says it's bad, it's ruinous, it's this, it's that. And, you know, and I lived through that in the 70s when people paid for qualitative things. They paid their executives for qualitative or for earnings per share, and the stock price didn't go up. And it drove the boards and the shareholders crazy. And ultimately, in my opinion, yielded the hostile takeover move of the 80s, which released enormous value, which then got absorbed. I forget who wrote it. There's an academic article. We're all Henry Kravis now. Maybe Steve Kaplan, I think, wrote, we're all Henry Kravis now. We're all, you know, that the executives themselves increased their leverage, cut their costs, you know, did the things that a buyout person would do. And so, you know, TSR is everything. And when I said to Roger, I made the same argument to him in a debate that you've lost this in the court of public opinion. He basically said, well, the court of public opinion is wrong. And, you know, and there's some medical analogies that he used that said, you know, you can't ultimately change people's mind. Well, if we're going back, if we're going to move away from TSR and we're going to move away from peer groups, it's, I think it would be wrong on both counts. Again, the perfect be the enemy of the good. But it's just, you're talking decades, you know, or a decade at least. It would have to really transform the say-on-pay voting process. And yes, I don't know how I feel about ISS sort of adopting sort of peer groups. They had to choose. They have 3 quantitative tests. They must, you know, this real relative degree of alignment, the multiple of median, and the 5-year trend line. They do regressions and they subtract them and square root of pi again. And well, the last one doesn't need a peer group. The first 2 need a peer group, and they are definitive that this is what they based their quantitative test on. I was in a meeting with them about 2 months ago, and basically the way that works is they have their quantitative test, and then if you fail that quantitative test, they then do a qualitative test. And I've been involved with a few companies who failed the quantitative test, but did some terrific things to then pass on the qualitative. Well, ISS has failed 600 companies over the last 2 years. And they claim, and they scolded us consultants for they said, you rely too much on the quantitative test. We really focus on the qualitative test. And when they said that, the entire room of 7 consultants burst out laughing, because the companies are appropriately obsessed with the quantitative test and are now shaping their peer group and shaping some of their pay decisions to, in fact, make sure that they pass the quantitative test. And you know, so that's sort of the reality that we have, and I think they should have a quantitative test. In the book, we redo the quantitative test that they do with realizable pay, and we find that they had many false negatives. In other words, companies who failed on their test and would have passed on realizable. For example, if a CEO gets 1 million stock options with a $20 strike price, and the Black-Scholes value is about $10 each. So it's $10 times 1 million is $10 million worth of grant date opportunity. And if the stock price goes from $20 to $15, that's a TSR, total shareholder return, of minus 25%. ISS would look at that and fail them because their high pay isn't aligned with their low returns to shareholders. Realizable pay would put a zero value on that because they're out of the money, and we would show alignment. And there are several dozen companies who failed because of that exact issue, who should have gotten a pass from ISS. So, you know, there's a lot to this. The other sort of big point that, and I've tried to, I've read the paper twice, and I keep looking for how do you start? If it's an internal market, how do you start with that? And I don't know if you're aware, there was this internal labor market, which was the name of a book, and a couple of economists in the, I guess in the early 80s, Doringer and Fiore, wrote a book on the internal labor market, sort of a similar kind of thing, the ratios and so on. And I had the same reaction to it. It's like, where's the ask? Some of you may not know this, but when you're recruiting a new CEO, they talk about the bid and the ask. I make this point in the book in the chapter where I show the attributes of a competitive market that the CEO labor market has, which are many. And this is one of them, that they talk about the ask, that the CEO comes and says, I want $8 million worth of stock, I want you to buy me out of my pension, I want you to do this, I want every other Thursday off, I want to use the private jet. And we call that the ask. I'm always on the board side, so we're on the receiving end of that. And then the bid, because we're bidding for the product, the CEO's labor, is then a counteroffer, and now you're negotiating. The peer groups are always used in that vein and in that regard, in that context, and I don't know what else would be an alternative. I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, why don't we take some questions and comments from the audience? We have an all-star panel. I think we have an all-star audience, a lot of experts from different parts of the executive compensation, corporate governance arena, companies, investors, advisors. I think there's a microphone at the back, Marcel. Anybody want to start with a comment, a question for Ira, or Charles, Craig? Anybody want to be on television?
Make a quick point, because I think Ira made some two points I thought were worth responding to. I think, first of all, Ira, I agree with you on TSR. I've always believed that TSR is an important component of the pay process, and I think it's not just important vis-a-vis in realizable pay, where if you receive restricted stock or options, where the value is. But I think it's also important in setting the total number, the target of the total number at the beginning of the year. I think how did you do last year versus are we rewarding you for past performance in the total number? And I think here we're not talking about the package itself, the way the package is composed, whether it's a mix of cash, stock. We're talking about, and I've always believed in a stock-based package, I think we're talking about the total, if you will, target number that the board starts with. And that does go to the peer group. And I've seen it a million times where the total package itself is judged against peers. Again, within the package, there's a lot of variation. And that's where obviously you build into your incentive part of the model. But to me, the total number seems to have gone up. With very rare circumstances have I ever seen that total number fall year to year, or expected pay. It always seems to ratchet itself up. But ignoring that, I think you make a good point about the paper itself. How do we structure internal pay? Will there always be a debate? I think that I like the DuPont model. Again, I'm not suggesting that's the way to do it, but Ed Woolard, whose chair I occupy at Delaware, fixed his pay at 150% of the pay of his direct reports. That's where the number came up with. And it was Fred Cook, I think, designed it for him. And it was a fixed ratio. There was not much negotiation once that ratio was applied, and I think it lasted for a while. He said, just take what they're getting and give me 50% more. That's where I think would be fair. I think ultimately an internal-based model that we're suggesting, and academics, by the way, always write papers that they leave some stuff unanswered. That guarantees you an audience for the next paper. It's sort of like, stay tuned for till next week, leaving you hanging. That is something I think we have to work out. I do think, though, that to me, an internal-based model that looks at internal performance and internal relationships within the organization, the pay structure in the organization, maybe some sliding scale multiple of what you pay the direct reports to the CEO, sliding scale based on the accomplishment of certain performance targets may be a way out of this. And in fact, it's interesting, I think, from the comp consultant standpoint, while it's very easy to stay comfortable and support peer groups because you're comfortable with the process, oftentimes in change comes great opportunity. And I think that if consultants were involved in designing the internal structure of pay in an organization, I think they would find that from a business standpoint there was as much to do as they found designing peer groups. Much like I think there was a lot of complaints about separating out the consulting firms. You remember a number of years ago between keeping consulting firms from working both sides of both management and the board, or doing other services. And in the end, what happened when there was this separation? Those left and created very viable and successful operations based on, I think y'all Pay for Governance, a group of folks who had left the bigger firms. And have done quite well on their own, giving independent advice to boards. I think the same thing can be said for a shift to an internal versus an external structure. I don't think it's devastating to the profession at all. And I think ultimately creates a more sensible model. Did you have anything? Because I think you had
I don't know. Do we want to talk about the private equity? I think private equity, it's very hard to tell whether they pay more or less than public, because there's no data. I've seen studies and stories that say they pay more, some say they pay less, some say they pay the same. It's impossible to really know. And I think you'd classify the private equity too as a subset of the turnarounds we discussed. Private equity is not operating a business for a long term. It's cleaning it up and turning it around to sell it. I think it's different than what CEOs day to day do. And as far as do they use peer groups, I'm sure maybe they use it as a reference, which we say is no problem. But it's certainly not dispositive. We actually had a meeting several weeks ago, or maybe right before Christmas, with an ex-S&P 500 CEO who had headed some private equity companies and was now on the boards of some private companies and some very large public companies. And he agreed completely with the paper. He said it was intuitive. It's what he thought. And that in private equity, he was aggressive with negotiating packages, and he thought about what the person would actually take, not what the market said or what it would take to get them there. And you have to remember also private equity is a lot of at risk, and it involves large chunks of equity in the company, and it's real significant pay for performance, which public is pay for performance, but private equity, you have to do the job right to get the payout.
That's exactly the point I was going to make. While private equity may use peer groups and does use peer groups, there are intense negotiations, no agency problems there at the table, and it's all strictly pay for performance. We talked about Mr. Nardelli and Home Depot, and he went to private equity and didn't make he could have made a lot of money, but he didn't make
Chrysler did not pan out.
Not for him.
No.
So let me comment on two things. One is on the ratio, and I don't want to get into anything about specific companies. So the ratio is a very bad piece of analysis. Both the 300 to 1, the CEOs. I mean, it's like dividing, it's like you did this. So the average house in the United States, I think, costs around $100,000. And it would be as if you went to buy an apartment, 2 blocks east of here where I live, and you said, I'm feeling that the housing market here is a little out of control, and it's a created market, and the real estate agents are in cahoots with the superintendents, with the this and the that. And I'm feeling I'm only going to offer you 300% of the national average. Will you take it? I mean, it's preposterous. And the question is the housing market for the average house in the United States the same as the housing market in New York City? And is the labor market for the average employee in the United States the same as the labor market for the chief executive officers? And the answer to that is categorically no. So taking two numbers and dividing by them, which you're allowed to do under the rules of mathematics, is in fact preposterous.
And under the forthcoming SEC rules on pay equity,
yes, and it's what does it mean? And you're going to have and it's in the income inequality debate, which is an important kind of concept, and there's good research that shows that the rising pay packages, because it's based on tax returns, so therefore they do look at realizable pay, and therefore the rising pay packages have in fact helped contribute to the income inequality, have contributed mathematically to that. Whether that should be fixed, how that should be fixed is beyond my pay grade, but nevertheless, it is in fact, that's a different story that no board of directors can resolve. And they are, in fact, very different labor markets, and it's just dividing them is not a good thing, and it will not work. That, in fact, if you did the 150% for all companies, then they would go to private equity, even with the hard people negotiating. And I do have a number of private equity companies over the years, probably 20, and they would say the exact same thing that if you interviewed a chair of a comp committee would say. We use the peer data as one factor. We do not look at recent financial performance, and I acknowledge, Craig, in the book and in here, that it is not the pay opportunity, the new decisions that they make do not, in fact, move with recent financial performance. That may be wrong, but that is the way it's done now. I actually think it's okay, as long as it's not above the median or too far above the median. It really shouldn't be above the median, and then let performance drive the realizable. And the second, and since you raised it, I wasn't going to bring this up, about the consultants that, you know, whether we gave, so the theory, the SEC, Dodd-Frank had this too. This came from the state of Connecticut and Charles and others, where they said that the full service firms were conflicted. I worked for one, and we were their actuaries, and then we gave them pay advice, and that we overpaid the CEO. This was the theory. We overpaid the CEO in order to keep the actuarial work. Well, it was preposterous and, frankly, insulting to our integrity. But then there were 4 major academic studies on this, and they all found that everybody paid the same, whether it was the full-service consulting firms or the boutique consulting firms. And yes, it has been very exciting to have started my own firm and be part of that. But you know, we haven't really changed our advice. And this is sort of one of those mythologies that sort of took on a life of its own, and they got implemented as policy. And I don't know how good that is. Luckily, there's only about 85 Republican votes that were probably lost by having this you know, change. But nevertheless, yeah, so nobody really cared. But it was a false, you know, premise and a policy that came out. And the fact that I view the fact that everybody paid the same as another example that it is a competitive market, an efficient market.
All right, I think we have a question from the back. Let's take that.
Yes, Charles and Craig, you mentioned DuPont as one company that uses the internal market structure. How many other companies have you come across that use that, and what have those companies, shareholders, and ISS said in response to those pay plans?
It actually is quite rare. The study that we've referenced before on the peer group says that they did a random sample of 100 companies and 96 used peer groups. So the other 4 vaguely did in some sense, I'd imagine. But it's most companies, and it's systemic, most use the peer groups today. I don't know of many that do the internal equity. I think maybe Whole Foods might have done it for a while, but it's rarely used, and the peer group is the go-to, and it's what's done.
And please don't believe that an internal pay model or even some sort of a multiple it results from an argument at our point on, quote, fairness, if you will, in the process. We're looking ultimately for the best incentive structure that makes the organization work to create the greater TS, total shareholder return. The ultimate goal here is shareholder return. And how do you create the most effective incentive structure? Incentive that moves kind of both ways. It's not just incentive to the CEO, it's an incentive to people who work in the organization to work hard. I mean, the greater the gap or perception of the gap exists within a corporation, the harder it is for those who work for the company to give it their full effort, if you will. And you begin to see this divergence in their interest and the CEO's interest. And when that happens, you create, in my view at least, a real incentive problem to get people to do the right thing. I can remember once standing in line at the trade station in Wilmington. Funny story, true story. And there was the 2 people there had canceled a train. They were standing in line, and 2 people ahead of me were griping about the fact that it was being canceled, and they had worked for a company whose CEO was in the paper that morning of this, this big package. And they were talking about the package. I'm just standing there overhearing them. And we get up to the line, and the person said, well, look, the next train at your fare will be in an hour, but or 2 hours, but I can put you on first class in 35 minutes, but it's double the price. And the guy looked at the other and said, oh, so-and-so took away a couple of whatever this guy was taking, first class for us both. And they laughed, and they got on the train. I mean, silly story, but it symbolized in a funny way how that structure did impact the other folks in the organization. And there is something to be said, I think, for a board to consider that a ratio or approach or an internal approach that seems to be consistent with the pay structure of the organization makes sense. I was talking to someone the other day who talked about two separate bonus pools, the CEO bonus pool and everybody else's. And the question was, why aren't the two combined? Why is the CEO set and cast in a different light from everyone else in the organization that creates the wealth that the CEO is stewarding? It was a good point. It's an incentive point. So I don't, please don't take it that, oh, fixed ratio, let's make it fair. Fixed ratio or a sliding scale ratio that creates appropriate incentive that creates appropriate return. And again, that's just a suggestion. The DuPont model is an interesting one. A lot of companies haven't done it, no. However, DuPont has been successful, and they have been successful at retaining talent, for better or for worse. Few people leave the place, and it has had a decent track record. Does that mean everyone should follow it? Not necessarily. It's simply a data point to think about as we hopefully reconstruct something out of the peer group.
Charles, we have another question.
Oh, our funder. Hello, John.
Hi. Voltaire was a very smart man. So let me, you guys are somewhat arguing past each other in that, Ira, you keep arguing about what is and the world that we all have to live in with ISS, with SEC disclosure of peer groups, with what people do. Charles and Craig, you keep arguing that what isn't perfect. And could be better. So I'd like to ask you guys to reverse positions for a second. Charles, in the last answer, you started answering this, but given if you were now the director of an S&P 500 company and you were the chair of the comp committee, and given the role that peer groups currently play, what are the factors that you would put into designing a plan, and specifically how would you define, it's fine to say it's a data point, but how would you define how much weight to give the data point of the peer grouping, assuming it's unfairly and everything else not gained? Ira, if you were an academic and you were sitting there trying to design a compensation structure, irrespective of what the current regulatory and real world situation of ISS is, what role would you give to peer groups, and how much emphasis would you give to internal metrics?
That's a very good question. Charles, you want to?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, I think the peer group, I would reduce it down to a sort of an interesting point of interest, as opposed to a dispositive or near dispositive point. In other words, I wouldn't start with the peer group. Typically, at least I've seen, as far as I've seen it, the peer group is presented, and peer group results are presented at the beginning of the discussion. Here's how the total package stacks up against everyone else. It starts the discussion. I think I would reduce it to, in my view, to a data point within the discussion. Once we've come up with an internal package, let's say, an internally designed package. By the way, just a reality check, are we really out of whack with the rest of the world? And I think that to me would be meaningful. But to use the peer group as the starting point for the discussion concerns me a bit, and that's where I think that what should be needs to shift. Designing an internal pay package, that's, as I said, that's the next paper. I mean, I think you have to look at what the pay structure is within the organization. How is the mix of pay done up and down the levels of the organization, and somehow take that philosophy, make the CEO's pay consistent with that philosophy. We tend to somehow separate out the CEO's pay. It's something else. It's their own bonus pool. It's their own approach. It's their own plane, if you will. And I think it has to be designed within the context of the entire organization. I've seen boards that just haven't done it that way. You've got CEO's pay and everyone else's. And I think you need to bring the CEO's pay into this linkage. Again, the theory has always been, if we don't, this person will jump and go somewhere else. And I think the contribution this paper makes is it says, no, the person isn't. The skills are company specific. And when they do move, they don't do such a good job other places. So don't worry about them jumping. Focus on incenting them within the structure of the organization. And as a director, if I were chair of a comp committee, I think that's precisely what I would try to start thinking, which, by the way, in the past, I hadn't thought that way. I've got to admit, I was a devotee of the superstar theory. I believed that, there was talent that could run any company effectively, and you had to pay for that talent. But the older I've gotten, the more I've seen it, I don't believe that anymore. And I think Craig's results were, in fact, correct. That your skills are company specific, learned over a long period of time, and focus on that, and focus on consistency within the organization.
So Ira, if you were writing on a whiteboard, you were a professor at a Center on Compensation and Governance, how would you?
I would take the summer off. And try to not teach more than 2 classes a week. So, sort of my pie in the sky solution is that, and this has always struck me as a little bizarre in the corporate world. So they say, you don't really hear this anymore because every company has a long-term incentive plan and a short-term incentive plan. But I've been around long enough that when there were no, and the banking industry had neither stock nor annual plans, all salary and pension. And then it evolved. They got short-term plans, annual plans, and then they got long-term plans. And many, and putting them in the 80s and 90s, putting in these long-term plans, one of the arguments was, which I thought was bizarre, was that we really need a long-term plan because the short-term plan is really driving them towards short-term performance, so we need them to think long-term. And I was thinking, well, why don't we just get rid of the short-term plan? Or why don't we create stock ownership? I mean, that's a bizarre, that's like a, I don't know, adding on a bolt-on solution to something where the, the core thing is the problem. So basically, what I would do is I would have an annual plan only that would pay out sort of whatever the number is, and I'll come back to the number in a second. And then I would pay that number 20% in cash and 80% in stock with fairly substantial, like an ExxonMobil or a GE model, where some of it vests in 3 years, some of it vests in 10 years, and some of it vests when you quit. And therefore, saying that, now you're in the world of human capital, in the human capital strategy, and that your recruiting strategy, you'd have to recruit some different people than you otherwise would have recruited. You want to have people who are thinking for the long term. And I've noticed that those companies that have that sort of longer perspective, and there are very few of them, that they in fact have a different kind of person. Maybe better, both successful, maybe better, maybe worse, but a different kind of person. So now the question is, what's the quantum? And the way I would do that is I would say, let's pick a number, 10% of market cap, and at the end of a career, I want the CEO to have accumulated that pre-tax. So if the market cap, or some number, if the market cap is $1 billion, that's 100 million, maybe that's too much, maybe it's 6%, but some number. And then I would present value that, divide it, annualize it, and then do something like what I said in the first instance. And I think that you would then have to recruit someone who would be willing to take that on. And that recruiting effort would be, I think first of all, there's business judgment rule problems with that. I know you probably wouldn't lose a lawsuit over it, but you haven't followed, these directors, again, 10 days a year, they don't want to be sued. And, yes, say on pay, it says there's safe harbor rules and blah, blah, blah. It's lots of things I don't understand. But there are suits, and it's very annoying and embarrassing. I was in 2 meetings this week where they talked about the say on pay lawsuits. And it was like really boring because it's like going nowhere. But it's like it's in the room. It's a gorilla. It's a 400-pound gorilla in the room. And then the second is, how many candidates, if it takes 10 candidates now to find a CEO who'll take a peer group pay package, because the candidates do the peer group analysis. Again, it's a cultural kind of thing. But to find a candidate who would ignore that and sort of take we'll give you 1% or we'll give you 50 basis points of equity every year based on annual performance, up or down, blah, something like that. To find that candidate, I think you'd have to go through 100 candidates. To find the right candidate, you'd have to go through 100 kind of person screen. That would be my answer.
Sounds good. We have, I think, time for one more question. Can you go to the mic?
I think as far as the difficulty finding the candidate, I think that our view of it potentially gives you a lot more flexibility in designing really innovative pay packages like that, and gives you the flexibility to vary it and do what you think is best. If you buy the view that the candidate has been inside the company for 20 years and is not going to move and their skills are specific to it, when you do promote the insider, you have, I think, a lot more flexibility than boards imagine they do because of the retention problem to really try something new and interesting.
Hi, I had sort of 2 unrelated questions, just thinking about how to deal with a couple of issues in executive pay. And one thing I wanted to ask about was volatility in the stock markets and realizable pay, and whether it would make sense to think about methodologies for smoothing out the, quote, returns that executives get from their pay packages, which could in turn influence the culture in the way that Ira is talking about with some of the 3- and 10-year payouts. And then entirely separately, this is more for Charles and Craig, what role can or should wealth accumulation analyses play in executive compensation decision making.
So let's start with Ira. What about the impact of volatility?
So I've always had mixed feelings about annual grants of stock. They have their advantages and disadvantages. For a while there, after the tech bubble, a lot of companies had huge amounts, billions, tens of billions of dollars of underwater stock options, and they weren't being exercised, and ISS was counting them against their overhang and so on, and people had trouble getting more shares to grant. And I suggested to several large cap companies that maybe it wouldn't be the end of the world if they skipped a grant, an annual grant, and they looked at me like I had lost my mind. And basically, so the annual grants, or that was just an introduction to saying annual grants and dollar cost averaging, in fact, take care of that problem as a general matter. Now, the annual grants then raise the problem of, if you're, like what happened in 2009, when from 2008 the stock market was here, then it went down, and then it recovered. And the companies that got the big grants of stock options at that lower stock price, as you know how the Black-Scholes work, well, the value of an option was much lower, so they got many more, and then they did extremely well on that. I actually had a client argue, and their 2009 grant went hugely into the money, like $100 million for the employees. And because they didn't even have enough shares, so they only granted like $3 or $4 million worth of opportunity, they argued that their pay was low that year. And they got laughed out of the room when that came up. So I think the dollar cost averaging sort of takes care of that, and the realizable pay is the correct way to look at that.
So Charles, what do you think about wealth accumulation targeting as a factor?
Well, it's the question is, if you pay someone too much, what happens when they in fact said, "That's it, I'm retiring"? And what's that? What is your magic? I remember I was involved in one company once, and the question is, "Oh, this person has reached their magic number; they're gone." Like, what do you mean by the magic number? Craig, you had some thoughts on that. I wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting problem. I don't know if the CEO is the type to retire because they've reached enough, but if they are, you run into kind of a problem where the more you pay them, the more susceptible they are to having enough and retiring. But I think as far as the risk to bring it back, I guess, academic sort of, it's interesting that for a decade or so or longer, the financial economists particularly and some other people in academics have argued that it doesn't make sense to subject the CEO to the vagaries of the market, to let their package go up and down depending on the whims of speculation, of macroeconomic changes, of whatnot. And they've advocated relative performance pay, which is that they factor out the pay of your peers and other similar companies in your industry. And then the executives' pay is then based on only how much they outperform or underperform, which is argued to say it's a better metric, and you lose some of the inefficiencies of transferring risk to executives. And they argued about this for decades and never figured out why companies didn't do this, because it was so obviously to them efficient. And I was at a conference a couple months ago, and I heard somebody talking about who had used it and I believe had stopped using it, and the problem was simple. It was just too complex to understand. To get back to what Ira says, I mean, a stock grant and cash is all it takes. People are not that mechanistic I mean, it took long enough, they said, for executives to figure out options and what the value of that was. And then to have this relative performance thing thrown in, it was too abstract, and it didn't make sense. It didn't translate to actual incentives. So that's the risk, and I guess now you just give the stock and you hope for the best, and I don't know how you factor it out, and there certainly is a difficulty in measuring what the executive's actual contribution is. I'm sure it's great, but yeah, Enron was seen as a great company, and Thomas Edison went bankrupt. It's tough to tell, whether it's the market or the executive. So it's a difficult situation. Well, certainly.
I think on that happy note, we ought to wrap it up.
Could we make some very brief closing? Could I make
sure. A brief closing comment from each of you. Let's keep it short, and go ahead.
So
30 seconds.
Okay. I'm going to give some predictions and prognostications. One is peer groups will survive in the current form, and usage for at least 10 years. Two,
10 years.
Pay for performance will continue to be, pay and performance will continue to be aligned using realizable pay for a very long time. Number 3, CEO pay is, realizable pay is going to come down because of the decline in the use of stock options. And number 4, this is very bold, CEO pay is going to continue to be very controversial.
Going out on a limb there on the last one? In summation, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I agree with his last point. Thank goodness. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a job, right? Anyway, we're going to have debates like this. I think I'm hoping that the peer group begins to see the end of its time. I think it was created in a very strange way. Its justification, I think, is not sustainable, and ultimately we're going to have to adjust. Look, when I first got into this business, directors were paid in cash. There was no such concept of a director owning stock in a company. In fact, when I first got started and suggested, I was told that why would a director ever invest in a company on whose board they sit? And it was considered, if we take stock, we're not independent anymore, are we? Like, independent of who? You're supposed to be related to the people who elected you anyway. That changed rather dramatically, and today we see most directors with significant equity holdings in the company. So I'm not worried that things can't change, and I hope the peer group does change, because I think its history was rather odd and haphazard, and certainly its justification today, at least from the research we've done, is quite problematic. Ultimately, the pay is important in that pay has to incentivize someone to do the right thing for the business to ultimately produce shareholder return. The question is, how does the pay fit into that ability to produce the return? And I do think that there is something to be said for pay of the CEO fitting into the context of pay at an organization itself to produce the wealth, have the employees produce the wealth that the shareholders enjoy. I think something to think of.
And that's where you started. Yeah. So let's, Craig, do you have another word?
No, I'll let this wrap up. Thank you all for listening to us, and thank you for coming.
Well, let me thank you. This has been a great and lively discussion, as we promised it would be. Will you join me in thanking our panel?